Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 292. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And today, I am joined by Jesse Walker from Rough Hands BJJ in Kentucky. Jesse, how's it going, my friend?
Hey, Steve, how are you?
I am doing great. For the listeners who don't know, Jesse has been a longtime friend of the show, but I actually got a chance to meet him in person recently at our Michigan camp. But probably best if you explain. Jesse, why don't you go ahead and give yourself an intro?
Sure. I'm Jesse Walker. I am a jiu-jitsu black belt. I've been training, I was trying to think about that earlier today, probably around 13 years. I've been coaching some sort of fighting for, I guess over 15 years now. So I've been at it a while. I'm a combat-based affiliate. So I'm with Chris and Melissa Haueter. And we run a school here in Louisville, Kentucky, Rough Hands, me and my spouse, Shelby. And I think that pretty much covers it.
Awesome, man. Thanks for the intro. And I got to say, I was a bit confused when I met you at first because in our Discord, your name is Big Lou. And it took me a long time to reconcile. How is a guy named Jesse Walker Big Lou at the same time?
Yeah, it is a silly little nickname that has kind of lasted since probably middle or high school, and it just became a shorthand username on the internet, and it just kind of has stuck. So
as it goes, thanks so much for coming by, man. And the topic we wanted to discuss here was building on something that you actually taught at our camp. So backstory for the listeners who don't know, at our camp, we did a 5-day intensive in Lansing, Michigan at Magic BJJ. Jesse was one of the instructors, did an awesome seminar on using your head in jiu-jitsu. Now, of course, you listen to this podcast and you might think that's all about being smart, but really it was about ramming your head into the other person's body and making them miserable. My favorite type of jiu-jitsu. But something that you said in one of the lessons that you did, Jesse, was you talked about something called the paradox of control. And the way that you explained it, I'd never heard this concept before, but when you explained it, I kind of thought to myself, man, I wish someone had told me this when I got to brown or black belt. And now I'm kind of thinking it's something that should be a mandatory explanation for anyone who gets to that level, because it's a really cool example of how sometimes you have to break the rules to do things right. But maybe introduce the concept as you explained it, because you did a great job of teaching it to the group. I'd love to hear your explanation again for the broader audience on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. So when I think about the paradox of control, when we're talking about jiu-jitsu as a game, it's a control-based game. So stands to reason, you could quickly assume that the more control you have, the better, right? But I'm sure you and the listeners as well have probably been in situations where you've got things so tied up and so buttoned up that there's no movement or no way to advance or progress what's going on during the game. So there are certain cases where you can either have too many resources devoted to the control, or you're just both in kind of a weird position where you can't move. And at that point, we have too much control and we have to figure out a way to throttle back on the control so that we can start generating movement again in hopes of getting that submission.
It's funny you bring that up, because I remember when I started jiu-jitsu, I had this conception in my head, a misconception really, that if you were really good at this, you could hold a position for as long as you wanted and no one could do anything about it. And that was just a total sign of mastery. And so my focus at that level was about being overly controlling. The idea was, look, if I wanted to get to mount, my idea of a good mount would be, it's impossible for you to move me. I can hold this as long as I want. But my thinking has changed a lot over the years. And I understand now that a big part of being dominant is not just holding the same static position, but being able to move in and out of that or reacting to what your opponent does. And it's not the end of the world if you lose a position, as long as you maintain a dominant topside position, right? I mean, if I'm mounted on you and you do something, you start to hip escape, I mean, that's not the end of the world for me if I'm able to pivot to side control, then knee on belly, then mount again. I mean, in fact, if I do that, I get an extra 6 points, right? So even from a rule set perspective, it's better for me sometimes to let you do these things. That doesn't mean that I have to let you regard. But if you as the defender start displacing me and forcing me to move, it's not necessarily the end of the world. And in fact, sometimes good jiu-jitsu looks like that. It's not always about, as you said, stalling things out and denying all movement. Sometimes you need movement in order to make things happen.
Yeah, that's right. And I think context is important, right? You know, some folks that get into jiu-jitsu for self-defense reasons, I can certainly conjure up a scenario out in the world where control is really all that matters, right? Maybe there's a reason that you need to control and hold this person down for an indeterminate amount of time. Then in that case, there probably can't be too much control. But if we're talking about playing the game of jiu-jitsu, as much as it is a control-based game, it's also a movement game. I'm not sure the first person that I heard say it, but you know, I've often heard over the years, attack transitions instead of positions. Because it gets really hard once you get fixed and stationary to make anything happen. But as soon as you allow some of that movement, or some of that movement just happens kind of out of your control, that starts to present opportunities to either finish the game or continue to progress in the game.
That's actually a really good point. We've talked about this so many times, how it is almost impossible to hit a technique from a dead stop. Usually against a good opponent, when you get a technique, it's the second or third or maybe even fourth or fifth attempt in a sequence of things that you're doing. Against a good opponent who's in full alignment, it's going to be very hard to do something that just works right away. And this, I think, is a weakness of the way a lot of traditional coaches teach, where they're teaching based on techniques, because it gives people the misconception that getting a technique is kind of a one and done thing. Whereas in reality, it's about a fluid attack sequence. And yeah, like you said, you attack during transitions. That's the best time. I mean, we've talked about micro transitions on the podcast, but usually your best advances in position and your best attacks, they're not going to happen from a formalized, stable, established position, but they're going to happen in between when you're transitioning from one thing to another, or where your opponent is trying to transition. They're trying to re-guard or turtle. That's where a lot of the openings happen that you can exploit.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I also think, although I am probably considered a heavyweight, I'm over 200 pounds, I feel like I roll and I play the game fairly differently than most people my size, in that I tend to be pretty floaty. I've gotten to a point where I do like some movement on the bottom if I'm on top. But even for people that do just like that, I've got to absolutely capture all movement. This also affords you an opportunity, if you get good at this skill, that you can throttle back on the control in certain places and kind of predict their movement, right? So as you start controlling variables, then they get down to 1 degree of freedom. They can only move their arm this way and in this direction. It almost makes you feel psychic to your opponent, because you're able to react to it even before it happens, because you know it's getting ready to happen. So I've always found that really interesting, of getting to a point where you let people move in particular ways and control those degrees of freedom to help you along the way.
Let's expand on that a bit, because I think for many people that's counterintuitive. Many people think that good technique is about leaving no openings whatsoever, just an impermeable defense where people have no options. And although, like you said, there's a place for that, sometimes you want to hold someone in a static position. There are downsides to doing that as well. And one of those downsides, as you mentioned, is if I hold you in a static position, in a competition standpoint, I am denying any further point scoring or submission opportunities, because I'm tying myself up as well. And I love that point you brought up about how if you're the one who created the opening, then you can exploit it. You can know what the predictable response will be from your opponent, and then you can attack it. A very common example that I love and that we talk about a lot is point farming. When you pass the guard, letting the person establish a really weak quarter guard again, and then just passing again, doubling up the points, but also defeating them psychologically, because it's frustrating to be held in a static position. But in a lot of ways, it's almost even more frustrating when you think you had a chance to escape and you burn the energy to do it, And you wind up in a worse off situation because you tried. Now you're not just attacking them physically, but psychologically as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it does. Your opponent will find it really frustrating when they feel like, ooh, I found a way to move my arm or my hips or whatever it is. Maybe I've got something here that I can start turning around, only to fall into a trap, right? And you can also use that in some respects defensively as well, right? So you can get so stuck, even if you're on the bottom and you're getting squished. Once you get familiar enough with the game, you have a sense of where things are probably going to go. And you can start to bait like, ooh, I bet they're looking for this underhook or, whatever else it is. And you can start laying some of those traps out there, which will present opportunities for escape or position improvement.
Yeah. I believe Rich Franklin actually did a TED Talk one time about this. And he was talking about the importance of knowing how to lose and knowing how to fail. And he told a story of a match he was in where he was mounted, he was losing. I mean, obviously this is MMA, so being mounted is a lot more dangerous than in jiu-jitsu, and he couldn't get out and he was going to lose the fight. What he wound up doing, and I hope I'm not misremembering this, but he intentionally gave up the arm. He baited an arm bar. His opponent took the bait, lost the entire position. Rich got up on top, and I believe he wound up winning the fight as well. And all of these things are examples of what instructors will tell you never ever to do. But sometimes when you create these openings, if you do it intelligently, there's an aspect of deception at play. You can start to mess with your opponent's head and kind of steer their behavior. And like you said, and as Rich explained in that illustration, you can use that defensively as well. I mean, it's not always the best idea when you're in a terrible position to give up something in the hopes that you get out, but it is a valid strategy. I mean, if you have really good confidence in your ability to defend something, oftentimes that's the easiest way to get on top. This is part of why I love turtle so much. I mean, people say it's a bad position, and to some extent that is true, but if you have more confidence in your defense than your opponent should have in their offense from that position, sometimes it's a gamble that's worth taking.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I feel like after, I don't know if we can really put a belt on it, but just hypothetically, let's say, past purple belt, we get to a point where so much of the game has to be about obfuscation and trickery, because the games have become so tight and so good and so few mistakes get made that you have to bring a psychological component into the game because the physicality is not getting it done.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we talked about the fake guard retention scenario where you give up your ankle and you let someone get a quarter guard so that you can pass again. That's probably an obvious example of the paradox of control, where you are intentionally creating a weakness so that your opponent is baited into trying something, and then you exploit the fact that they tried. Are there any other good examples that you like to use or that you teach or see at your gym where it's actually wise in some cases to give up the control in the hopes of getting some more movement going?
Yeah, I mean, I think so many of the pinning situations, whether it be mount or a side control, if you're really smashing them, and it's hard to use some of the examples I talked about in the seminar because they're a little bizarre, but let's just say kind of a pretty standard side control configuration. If you're really smashing and laying into them and give them just a little bit of room, sometimes you can bait things like, oh, they're going to try to stick a crossface in there and get them to overcommit with those things. And then potentially you have opportunities to attack the arm or move it out of the way and set up different chokes. So anytime people have space, their tendency is to try to fill it. And hopefully they know why they're filling it. And that's mostly true, right? If people are making space, one of you is probably going to need to fill it in this game. So if you can convince them that they're going to need to be the first one to fill it, you can start taking advantage of that.
Yeah. You talked about side control. It's kind of funny because one of the things that I was always taught, and I'm sure you were as well since day one, is if you want to have a really nasty side control, you want to get up on your toes and drive all your weight into the person. And, my favorite classic variant of side control is the old shoulder of justice, where you're kind of putting all your weight down through your shoulder into their jaw so they can't even look at you. I mean, I take nothing away from that. It's a beautiful, incredibly unpleasant position to hold someone in. But I got to the point where I realized, yeah, it's great to hold someone in, but sometimes you want to do more than just hold them there. Against a more junior grappler, if I put the shoulder of justice on them, I might be able to just break them psychologically from the pressure. But against a black belt, if I do that, they've been there so many times that me driving my shoulder into their jaw, that's just another day at the office. They don't care, right? They'll be patient. They'll wait it out. They're not going to do anything stupid. So what I do now a lot of the time is instead of getting up on my tiptoes when I'm in side control and trying to put all my weight down, I intentionally take some of the weight off. And in fact, a lot of the time, I will go onto my knees. I will do the cardinal sin of side control, the thing they say never ever do. And the reason why is because then instead of just driving pressure into the person, I'm kind of floating over top of them with many points of contact on the floor. You know, I might have my knees on one side. I might even have my arms or something on the other side. I've got many points of contact over the floor, and it feels less oppressive to the opponent because they don't have that weight coming down, and it gives them confidence that they can start moving and trying stuff. But if you've ever had someone in that classic judo pin on top of you, the four corners pin, I suppose it's called, where, you know, they've got 2 hands, 2 feet on the floor, often the hands, elbows, the knees, it's very hard to get out of that because the person on top can move around so much. So rather than just holding them in a shoulder of justice for however long, what I like to do now is kind of just float on top of them on my knees, make them work, and then I just kind of follow them and let them whittle their energy down and look for openings. It's counterintuitive because it's an imperfect pin. You're giving them something, but it also is a great situation because I can respond to all of these openings they might be giving me.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, you know, when we go back and think about what a perfect pen is, you mentioned earlier, against a equally sized and skilled individual, perfect pens aren't really a thing. Like, it's really hard to control and keep controlling a resisting opponent, right? They're moving, at least they're trying to move. It's tough. When you get to that point, and assuming that you're probably not going to be able to stop all control unless it's just kind of a weirdo situation, being able to control enough that you can predict their movements, right? We talked a bit about that at the camp a little bit. Like you were kind of mentioning, my side control is almost like a front side crucifix most of the time. So I kind of have both arms stapled to the ground, but there's really not a lot of weight down on their chest. And particularly for big people, they try to bicep curl me off. You know, it's predictable. They all do it. And that gives me opportunities because I know they're going to be bicep curling me off side to side, one direction or the other. That gives me opportunities right there to either move to mount, attack the arm. So these patterns start to become really predictable.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, you know, we've talked a lot about the advantages of this philosophy if you're a point scoring person, if you're in a tournament setting. But honestly, even in like a self-defense setting, as a person who's often the smaller one in the role, I have found that laying off the pressure can sometimes be beneficial just for holding a better position overall. This is kind of a weird thing that took me a long time to realize, but putting more weight down on your opponent is not always a good thing, because when you drive your force into your opponent and you connect with them, you give them the ability to counterforce and to push back into you. An example that was very meaningful to me was, I think when I was around purple, maybe brown belt, I had a lesson on mount from my instructor. And up until this point, I was dog shit at mount, as many lower belt people are. I just found that, look, if I get to this position, as soon as I try to do anything, they do a big bridge and I go flying, and what's the point of the stump position? And something that my instructor said is, look, if you want to play mount, you want to ride them kind of like a jockey rides a horse. You don't want to be putting all of your weight down on top of them. You want to give them just a little bit of space, like a ½ inch to an inch. So you're kind of hovering just a little bit, sort of like how a jockey doesn't always have their ass connected to their horse. They're kind of standing up a little bit sometimes. And the reason why is because then when they try to do that big explosive bridge, they just hit dead air. They don't hit you directly. And by the time they actually make contact with you, a lot of that force is dissipated. Whereas if you were trying to wet blanket them, put all of your weight down, when they do a bridge, all of that force is going to hit you and it's going to send you flying. And so something that I learned is a lot of the time, more tightness, more downward pressure, it's not always good, because especially if you're much smaller than the other person, if their ability to bench press is greater than your gravitational weight, that's not a good trade. If you try to wet blanket them and you weigh 150 pounds, but they can bench 250 pounds, if they get their hands in there, they will send you for a ride, regardless of whether it's quote unquote good technique or not. So again, kind of another example of where sometimes even in a supposed self-defense situation, offering a bit more space can be beneficial because it makes those big explosive movements less powerful.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think people, regardless of its effectiveness in the moment, most people tend to defer and expect that kind of crushing pressure from the top, whether it's mount, side control, whatever else. But I, like you, I tend to play a little floatier. for that reason. You become like a shock absorber, right? As opposed to just taking all of that and getting yeeted across the floor, you're able to kind of ride that wave and stay on top, which is, whether you're playing the game or for self-defense, is hardly ever a bad thing.
Yeah, I know you just had our mutual friend Rob Bernacki down for a seminar at your school, Rough Hands, and something that Rob has talked about before is the idea of constant versus variable tension. And I love this explanation because no one teaches this stuff, but it makes a huge difference. Constant tension, where I'm just always tight, I'm squeezing as hard as I can, I'm just like a big immovable rock. It has its limitations. A part of the limitation, of course, is that you can't move very easily when you're that tight. But also, if you're constantly tight like that, you become predictable and exploitable by your opponent. This is why when you're doing stand-up, you're often told you want to be loose with your hands, because if I grab you and I've got a death grip and my arms are really, really tight, it makes it way easier for you to predict a lot of my behavior. And also it gives you a stronger lever if you go to grab my arm. Whereas if my arm is loose and relaxed, if you go to try to pull on my arm, you're not going to be able to off balance my whole body as much. But the other thing too is if I'm constantly tight and rigid, it's easier for my opponent to bridge and push and drive off of me. And this is again part of the reason why we as black belts always encourage people to stay loose during jiu-jitsu. In a lot of cases, you often want to be loose, but then sort of like a whip, when it's time to go, when there's an opportunity to really get some benefit out of offering force, you crack like a whip and you hit them with all of your force in a split second, right? And I mean, these are two different thoughts. There are a lot of people who are good at playing a constant tension game where they just don't move. They just lock someone up and they're big and they're heavy. But I find that that's often going to be a game that works better if you're a big, strong person. A lot of other martial arts like judo, for example, are much more about the finesse where you're loose. And then when you see a window, bam, you just hit them with some force. That's also a great opportunity because it's harder for your opponent to understand what you're going to do next. If you, as a black belt, feel me tensing up in certain ways, you're going to start being able to guess what I'm going to do next. I mean, I see this a lot, for example, in guard. Like I'm sure you can relate. If someone is going to cartwheel past me, I know about 3 seconds in advance before they even try because they tense up and you can feel them loading their weight onto their legs. And I'm sorry, guys, it's very obvious what's going to happen. So sometimes being loose is better because it also gives you the opportunity to explode at a moment's notice and catch your opponent off guard.
Right. I think that's really insightful. I think we put such a premium on this idea of control. And sometimes I think, especially in the lower belts, people get not confused, but I don't think they necessarily have a real clear picture of what control is, right? I think people think of control being me building this rigidity in my own body and then dropping it like a cage on someone else. And that's not always the case. Sometimes control is, like we were mentioned earlier, maybe limiting motion here and there, but also allowing motion in particular directions. Just because you're moving your arm in a particular direction, that may be all that I'm allowing. And that is still a sense of control. And control also, I think, has to do with not being controlled. So to your point about this tension versus kind of relaxation or staying loose with it, you are turning your body into a gigantic lever every time you go rigid. And it makes you easier to move around, whether you're on the top or the bottom. So making it so that you are harder to control, I think, is really important for sure.
Yeah, that's absolutely a key, especially once you get to the higher levels where every grip fight becomes like a life or death battle, right? The ability to deny your opponent good levers on you is so key. I mean, as you know, and as I know, right? When you talk to Rob Bernacki, he'll talk about the importance of leverage in jiu-jitsu. And if you are giving your opponent good levers by being like thick and rigid and moving, that's not going to be the advantage you think, because a good grappler who understands leverage will turn that against you. So always just something to bear in mind. And again, that's a habit that I recommend people start trying to break as early as possible. It's an instinctive thing for a lot of people to be tight and rigid, because they're afraid when they don't know jiu-jitsu, right? They kind of shell up, they clam up, they get too tight and too stiff. But I always think that one of the best things that you can do early in your game is develop that strategic looseness to make it harder for people to turn your arms and legs into levers that they can use against you.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I've had the opportunity, in my eyes, it's an opportunity. I've had the opportunity to, roll and train with folks that are a lot smaller than I am. And I think that has really informed how I have played my game. Because when you are a lot bigger than that person, it does become relatively easy to get to that point of control where it's like, oh, well, we're both kind of at a position where we can't do anything, or You're so balled up, I can't get to you anymore. I've got to start letting off to let you move. I don't know that it's as easy to kind of find that moment when you're with someone bigger than you or the same size, just because control is so kind of tenuous generally early on when you're with opponents that are the same or bigger than you.
Now, here's a dilemma that I have faced for a long time, and it took me a while to kind of decide what I think about this. I came up in kind of a traditional jiu-jitsu game plan, where the idea was you try to take away control, you try to reduce movement, make things slow and predictable. I think most of us, as we get older, we all gravitate towards that game. And so for a long time, I thought that this was the quote unquote right way to do things. But then you see people, especially smaller and younger people, who are constantly in motion. They never stop moving. And I mean, at first you look at this, and if you come from an old school mindset, you look at them and you think, where's the control? These people are going 100 miles an hour. Like, don't I want to shut down movement? It looks like these people are almost encouraging it. In a lot of modern jiu-jitsu with like inversions and trying to go around the outside to take the back, a lot of it is a game of more movement instead of less. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Like, how do we, when and what type of person is better suited going for that kind of slow, static game versus more of like a faster movement-based dynamic game?
Wow, that's a great question. So I think I had the privilege at our school, for whatever reason, to have probably a majority at this point of grapplers over 35. So we've got a lot of old guys and gals here, at least in terms of this sport, we're old. I think age definitely plays a part. Age and size, I guess, in some respect. But I think things do start to slow down, as you may have noticed, as we get older. And I think that informs the way we play. There are some younger folks that, I see doing all the inversions and all the wild movements. And I tell them, I'm like, you're probably going to have to relearn a lot of jiu-jitsu when you turn 40, because the things that are working for you now probably aren't going to be working for you then. But I do think that there can be an interplay with those things. And you alluded to it earlier when you were talking about the cracking of the whip. Even if you played a faster style when your hips worked better and you had less arthritis or less weight or whatever it is, you do have to start building efficiencies into your game that will allow you to still crack that whip at appropriate times. That said, I mean, if you can play that fast style and it's working well for you, do it. I love watching it. I love seeing it. But even with my athletes that play that way, we still do put a pretty big premium on controlling movements and up to a point, being wild and squirrely. But when it comes time to get to a finish, things usually have to still slow down a little bit and get things locked in where you need them.
Yeah, the person who comes to my mind about this is friend of the show, Margot Ciccarelli. And I have a real hard time following her matches because I don't even know what's happening most of the time. She'll get like a lapel grip and a sleeve grip, and then she'll do 5 straight inversions, and then she's suddenly on the person's back. And I don't know it, and I don't understand it. And the way that she explained it to me was that there's kind of 2 different types of control. There's static control, which is I'm denying you movement, but then there's also dynamic control, which is I'm creating movement and I'm overwhelming you with the movement. And my gambit is that I'm better at playing this game than you are. And that however much we move, I can stay one step ahead of you the whole time and basically burn you out. And to me, as an old lazy guy, I look at that and I think, look, I'm all about economy of motion, right? If I can get on top of you with less effort, I want to do that instead of getting on top of you with more effort. But does that mean that one way is better than the other? Not necessarily, right? I mean, if your goal is to win a world championship this year, the fact that you can't play this game 20 years from now because you're too old is sort of irrelevant, right? I mean, if you're in a competition scene, you want to maximize your opportunity to win in the moment. And if you think your best chance of doing that is a highly dynamic movement-based game, then you're going to do that. So again, if you want to look at things from a totally purist standpoint, a lot of these movement-based games, they kind of violate the concept of economy of motion because you're achieving something with more effort rather than with less. But if you're a prime athlete and you've got the gas tank to do it, and you can do 5 inversions without burning yourself out, and you're willing to accept any risk of injury that might occur, that might be a valid strategy to win a world championship. Now, that said, 20 years from now, you're probably going to have to discard or heavily modify a lot of that stuff, as happens to all of us. You do not see many 50-year-olds doing like complex bolo sequences or flying bullshit, right? There's a reason why everyone, as our mutual friend Mike Mahaffey would say, there's a reason why we all kind of gravitate towards old bastard jiu-jitsu at some point, because it's cheap, efficient, it's simple, and everyone can do it at any weight class. And it's safe, it's predictable, it's low effort. There's a reason. But again, if you've got time-boxed goals and you've got to win medals in the next 5 years, I mean, you'll do what you got to do, right? And it's not up to me to tell people which strategy they want to use in the moment like that.
No, absolutely not. So I had a couple of thoughts about that. I mean, when we even going back to kind of early jiu-jitsu and this concept of letting them cook, right? We usually have the idea of, I'm going to get them under my mount and let them cook. Well, what Margot and others are doing is just the same. You're letting them cook. You're just doing it by overwhelming them with movement rather than, minimizing their own and making them struggle there. So in a lot of ways, it has a lot of the same effects. It gets them tired. It may get them psychologically doubting their ability to effectively finish the match. And from that standpoint, I think it's great. And at that age, when we're talking about folks in their teens and 20s, you can build efficiencies into those inefficient movements to where you're not, you've done them so often and you're so accustomed to them that you don't have to spend the reserves that normal mortals like me would have to spend to invert 5 times, which is imaginary to me anyway. I don't invert 1 time. But from that standpoint, I think that's absolutely right. You're meeting the goals just differently, which I think is great. I think it's fine.
Yeah, that's one of the cool things about jiu-jitsu is there's so many ways to solve a problem. And I think sometimes we get caught up on, well, what's the quote unquote right way to do this? Whereas really the right way is whatever you can do that actually works for you. And so sometimes I think when coaches like us give advice, people assume that we're speaking in absolutes and saying this is the way it must be done. But really, if you can make something work repeatably against good opponents, like that's up to you to keep using it, right? I think everyone who's been training for a long time has a few examples of things they do that people have tried to coach them out of, right? I'm sure you can think of some examples of things you've done where your coach has given you shit about it for years and said, this doesn't work or it's not optimal. But if you're able to just keep making it work, sometimes you've got to disregard the coach.
Yeah, that's right. And, with that in mind, I try to be very aware of that all the time and not be terribly prescriptive. And you'll often hear me on the floor talking about how I don't like to talk in absolutes. Even when I'm showing kind of specific techniques, a lot of times I'm talking about this is how I specifically solve this problem. I may have to solve it a little differently given a different opponent. So even my ideal movement for me is going to change based on who's in front of me or under me. Right. So I always try to be real careful about not being too prescriptive about that for that very reason. People need enough bones to hang meat on in terms of building their jiu-jitsu game. But I think people get maybe overly reliant, and understandably so, but overly reliant on, I want to copy how this person solved this problem, whether or not there's any chance that it could be right for me. And, one of my early coaches, when he was helping me kind of work on becoming a coach myself, he says, one of your big jobs is helping people find their jiu-jitsu. And that always really stayed with me. It is a very personal journey. And although we all talk about arm bars and triangles as if they're a static thing, we all have our own arm bars and triangles. And I think that's always really important to keep in people's mind.
Yeah. I mean, at the beginning, people might all be trying to do things in a similar way, but by the time you get up the ranks to black belt, you see significant variations in how people do different moves. I mean, there's things that I do a certain way that, as far as I can tell, other people really struggle to do just because of my particular body type or dimensions or attributes. I've got some options for some things that I'm just able to do. And then there's other things that just, man, no matter how many times I try them, it's not a move for me. An example that comes to mind for me is like Darce chokes. I just have really short arms. Usually people with longer arms are always telling me, how long your arms are, it doesn't matter. There's always adaptations you can make. And it's like, look, if you've got like pterodactyl wingspan, it's easy for you to say something like that. But for people with little T-Rex arms like me, there's just more efficient things to do, right? If I've got smaller arms, I'm probably going to want to try to snatch a guillotine or something. It's just going to be more effective for me. And similarly, there's other things that I can do because my arms are shorter. I can sometimes snake my hands into positions to get chokes that other people just don't expect. I mean, I do a variant of the Ezekiel choke that I've actually had to stop teaching because no one else seems to be able to do it the way that I do. And I think it's just because of some combination of like arm length, hand size, wrist flexibility, it's a very attribute-based move, I guess, and other people can't do it the way that I do. So when you get to a certain point, most of the revisions and improvements that you make from your game are going to be self-selected. They're going to be things that you've discovered or that you've bolted on that are maybe unique to you and not necessarily things that other people can just teach you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think as a coach, I always have to be really cognizant of that. I think we all should. Leg triangles are my example. So I've got little short Oompa Loompa legs. So doing a real traditional triangle, pull my foot up under my other knee, there's virtually no human I'm able to do that on. But with some certain modifications and cutting some angles, I can make it work. So then the question becomes like, well, which triangle do I teach in class? Which goes back to, telling people like, this is how I solve the problem. This is how other people solve the problem. Teach the controversy, right? I try to teach as many different kind of like, here's how it looks with some people. And if you've got little legs like me, maybe this will work better for you. But I think that helps really convey to people coming up that like, hey, just because we're all doing a thing that we call the same name doesn't mean that at the end of the day, when we are happy with the way we do it, that it's going to look like everybody else's.
Yeah. And that personality and personalization comes into play when we talk about how we choose to be static or dynamic, whether we go for control or movement. And the interesting thing is you can have different combinations in different places. You might prefer a more control-based heavy pressure situation in some circumstances, but you might also prefer a more movement-based situation in others. And in fact, a lot of the time, the way you can really mess up your opponent is by switching back and forth between them. You touched on this earlier about catching people mid-transition and about masking your intentions. If you're so predictable, if you're always going for heavy forward pressure, it becomes easier for your opponent to shut you down because they know what you're going to do. But if you want to really mess with people, you blend different things together. I mean, no one expects you to spend 30 seconds trying to pressure smash someone and then like switch to a rolling crab ride back take or something, right? People don't expect that because, it's like switching from chess to checkers. You're changing the game and you're breaking people out of their thought patterns. So always being tight, they're not necessarily things that you prescribe, but it's a spectrum and you want to slide along that spectrum based on whatever makes more sense in the moment.
Yeah, that's right. That makes me think I'll be really interested to see kind of how this, not that there haven't been fast movers in the past, but I feel like we're in a generation of jiu-jitsu players that tend to lean more towards the fast style of play. I'll be interested to see as they age how they're able to either maintain that or hybridize it in some way. I was a competitive gymnast until I was 13 years old. And so there are things that I don't even necessarily know that I'm aware of all the time that I do that would probably exhaust other people, but my body's just been doing it since I was 3 years old. So I don't really think much about it. So I'll be interested to see whether some of those efficiencies that they play with in their 20s are able to convert to something that's still relatively easy for them in their 40s.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me see if we can give some other specific examples to people of how all of this stuff plays out. I always love to give people kind of actionable demos here that they can take on. When it comes to the paradox of control, one example that I love to use is what I've heard people refer to as the double tap, which is where you go for a submission, you wait for your opponent to start trying to defend it, you then let off the submission, so they drop their defenses thinking that they've defeated it, and then you just go for the exact same submission again. I do this to people all the time, and I love it, where I'll go for like a choke. And of course, what am I going to do when I choke you? You're going to do the obvious defense. Probably you're going to bring your hands up somehow. And I mean, like I said, I do a lot of Ezekiel chokes, and you know how that choke is. If the person gets their hand in there and they block your hand, you can't really get the choke anymore. So what I'll do is I'll set up the Ezekiel, I'll let them defend, and then I'll just let it go. Like, oh, you got me. I'm not going to be able to finish this. And they'll drop their hands and go back to whatever escape they were doing. And then I just do the fucking Ezekiel again, right? While their defenses are down. So I've created an opening, and that's broken their thought patterns because now they're thinking, well, I've defeated that choke, so I can move on to the next thing. But they don't realize that choke was just on hiatus for about 3 seconds, and then it comes right back again. I've heard that called the double tap. I think is a hilarious name, but I'd love your thoughts on other examples of that, just ways that we can play with the paradox of control to be more effective at jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, I love that. I think one of the places I kind of first discovered it in myself of like, man, maybe I've got this person too buttoned up. Maybe this is why this is not working for me. It's just operating a closed guard, right? Some of the more kind of basic stuff of like get them in your closed guard and break their posture and hold them down. And you can get to a point where, you've got good head control and maybe you've got an overhook on them in a closed guard. And now you're in a position where they can't move and you've got so much resources devoted to keeping their posture broken, you don't have any means to attack them. And you kind of feeling stuck and you're like, well, I should be able to reach this and that. And you just can't do it because there's just no space and there's no movement. And that's kind of where it's like you start to discover like, oh, well, maybe it's not so much the angle that they're in, but their ability to move from one angle to another. And, oh, if I let them hand fight just a little bit more, maybe I can drag this arm across but just kind of holding on for dear life and hoping they don't pass your guard ends up being a loser all around. Because even if you do hold them, you're both stuck, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember one time I got into a Mexican standoff with my opponent where I was on top half guard. Again, this is going to become a pattern in this conversation, but I had him in an Ezekiel choke and he also had me in an Ezekiel choke. And neither of us could finish because the other person's hand was in the way because we were both Ezekiel choking each other. And neither of us could let go because as soon as one person did, the other person would finish the Ezekiel. So we wound up stuck in a dual Ezekiel for about, I don't know how long. It felt like forever. And then eventually at some point, my instructor walked by and negotiated a truce and we decided to both let go of the choke at the same time. But I thought that was hilarious. You can very much get yourself in that kind of situation where you are now stuck in a situation and getting out of that situation could be dangerous to you. An example that people often give, and I don't think this is necessarily true, but I hear this a lot, so I'm going to bring it up. People often say that the downside to kesagatame is that it's kind of the end of a sequence. So if you're going to get there, you better damn well be able to finish. Because if you don't finish, the person's going to get your back or do something like that. I will say I don't actually agree with that. I play Kesa a lot. I have a lot of ways to hold that position and transition back to other things. But that is kind of a statement that I hear a lot where people say, if you get there, you better finish because otherwise the other person's going to escape. And so what this often leads to is people playing a very rigid-based Kesa game where they get there and they realize, shit, I can't finish this. And then they just hold it because they're terrified of giving it up again. So this kind of situation can happen in Jiu-Jitsu where you feel like, man, I have to play a control game because the control is the only thing preventing this person from taking my back or sweeping me or reversing. So they'll just, like you said, they'll hold on for dear life. Which again, as you mentioned, is not a great strategy because eventually, if your strategy is hold on for dear life, you will eventually lose that control.
That's right. You will lose it eventually. Yeah, you're talking about half guard. It made me think about kind of how I play that top side half as well. A lot of times when people are playing top half against me, I experience a lot of pressure. They're trying to come in. They're trying to get past the knee shield. They're trying to smash me. More often than not, until I'm maybe even past the knee shield or ready to start passing, I actually sit. My butt is on my heels and I'm kind of sitting on that bottom foot. Now, that will keep them from standing up generally because they need that bottom leg to come up unless they're able to do a hip switch. But it often really confuses people because they're expecting this, like, oh man, there's this 200-pound dude. He's going to be smashing my knee shield down. And then all of a sudden they're not feeling any weight, any pressure. And I'm just sitting there kind of waiting to see what they do and how they move. It can be really off-putting.
Yeah, the example to playing with this paradox is you can often force the other person to make decisions in a time where maybe they don't want to, or you can force them to make decisions in the wrong direction. So, I mean, the knee shield is a great example, right? If the power of the knee shield is that it works best when the other person is driving towards you and trying to put pressure on you. So beginners often really struggle with passing the knee shield because they're trying to basically power through the person's knee, which is obviously not efficient and very hard to do. So really one of the best ways to defeat the knee shield is to just back off a little bit. And that then changes the whole game. It forces their opponent now to do something else because the knee shield loses some of its effectiveness. So as our mutual friend Josh Wentworth would say, you are asking them a question. You're basically creating a hypothetical for them. Well, you thought I was going to do X, but I did Y. What now, buddy? Like, what are you going to do now? And by doing that, you can force them to go into a direction that maybe they didn't want to go into. Or you can just throw their game plan off because they thought they had this scripted sequence of how this is going to go down in their mind, and you've done something that was unexpected. So again, that's another thing that's very important in jiu-jitsu is playing with forward pressure and knowing when to back off. There's so many situations where, especially guard passing, where if you want to get past someone's guard, the easiest thing to do is actually to back off for a bit and mess with the angle and then go back in again. That's just such a key thing. And I think it's another example of this paradox you're talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, something you said made me think about it. One of my coaches used to say, and I repeat it a lot, I firmly believe it. Anytime you can make a fight look different than what the person in front of you expects, you have an advantage, right? Whether that's out in the parking lot or on the mats, if they're expecting that pressure in a particular place and then all of a sudden it's not there, or they're expecting you to continue just to relentlessly try to finish that Ezekiel choke and all of a sudden it disappears, that normally gets a reaction out of people. And it's usually a reaction that you can take advantage of.
Yeah. In the world of psychology and sales, they might call this a pattern interrupt. The idea is you're doing something unexpected to break people out of their mental script of what they would normally do in that situation, which forces them to think a lot harder than they normally would. An example in the business world is if you're doing sales calls, right? And especially if it's a cold call, a lot of the time, look, if you get called by a telemarketer, you're not even listening to what they're saying. You're just waiting for them to shut up so you can say no and hang up, right? So a lot of the time, what salespeople will do is they'll try to figure out a way to say something that is so unexpected that it makes you stop and go like, what the fuck? I didn't expect that. And now suddenly your cognitive brain is engaged and you have to think about how to respond. I don't know if it's good advice, but you will sometimes hear this from self-defense instructors as well, who will say that like if someone's being really aggressive, if you say something completely unpredictable and nonsensical, you can catch them off guard for a second. Again, I'm not a self-defense instructor. I do not know if that's a true or a good idea, but I've heard this before.
It is true. Yeah, I actually came from the self-defense world. I think I refer to it oftentimes as a trigger question. Like you said, it can be ridiculous, but anything that starts to kind of get somebody back out of that kind of reptilian violence brain and back up to kind of the frontal lobe world, ask them what's their favorite transformer or, whatever kind of ridiculous question. It really puts people back. What did you just say? What was that? And it gives you a moment to act, whatever that act happens to be. And I think that there's a lot of corollaries, even though it may not be verbal. Although depending on how your jiu-jitsu game is, I guess it could be verbal too. There are a lot of corollaries to our game and doing unpredictable things.
So with that said, I want to expand on this because one thing that you will see, a very unorthodox strategy, is people who will abandon the predictable position in the hopes of doing something else. People who come to mind here are, Kazushi Sakuraba, a famous example of this, a guy who would give up his back, or Eduardo Tellez, right? Someone who intentionally goes to turtle. Now, again, this is not your number one high percentage strategy, but there are people who will do this. And personally, I have played with this and had a lot of success myself. Most of the time now granted, I am not competing at a world-class level. I'm just goofing around in the gym and having fun. So take this as you will. But I have found that a lot of the times doing things like giving up your back, it can really mess with people because they've got this pre-scripted notion in their head of how the roll's going to go. They're going to pass your guard and then they're going to do whatever. But if you give up your back, they can't do that. And so now you're trying to force them down a different pathway that they didn't expect. And if your defense and your game plan is good enough there, you can actually overcome the fact that game plan is suboptimal. And I think this is something that is so underutilized in jiu-jitsu, especially IBJJF jiu-jitsu, because the rules are designed to steer the game in a very particular direction that basically advertises Brazilian jiu-jitsu, right? We obsessively reward the guard. We've made it all about the guard, but there's no rule saying you have to play the guard. People just are accustomed to this because that's what the rules reward. But there are other strategies you could employ there too. And this is an interesting example of the paradox of control, where basically you're giving up all control. You're giving up a major advantage, but you're doing so under the assumption that you're going to force your opponent into a weaker part of their game and confuse them with what your intent is. An example that is becoming kind of hilariously interesting now is the resurgence of donkey guard. My brother has started using this a lot, right? For a long time, this position was a joke. It was actually banned in a lot of the tournaments because it was considered a joke. But it actually works real well, especially if leg locks are legal. Like you give up your back, you basically put someone in a reverse closed guard. You have full access to their legs. They can't do anything to you because your giant ass is in their way. It's a very awkward position. And people aren't going to expect that. They expect that you're going to play guard facing them. If you turn around and give up your back, it's often the last thing people would expect. So I'd love your thoughts on kind of diverging and giving up position like that, and if you think that's ever a good idea, or if that's kind of maybe a more fringe thing that people should avoid.
No, I mean, listen, most of us are hobbyists. Most of us are friends on the mats, are students. The vast majority are hobbyists. And they are in this for reasons other than winning world championships. And hopefully some of that driver is enjoyment of the sport. And sometimes enjoyment of the sport is doing wild and wacky things, or seemingly wild and wacky things, right? There are sets of predictable behaviors that you're generally going to get when you do things. And that may be unique to the school. That may be unique to the sport. You know, maybe everybody at your school, when they're doing a particular attack, does it with their right arm, and you know that. And so you're able to capitalize on it, put yourself in a little bit of danger, but you know where it's coming from, so you know you can act on it. I'll tell you, one of the places it's really come into play at Rough Hands lately is we have tried to figure out how to get good at strangling people from their backs without getting any hooks in or without using too much of our arms at all, because people will start giving their back up, and as soon as you start reaching across with your limbs, they will start attacking those limbs. Is it something that I would recommend someone trying to win ADCC do? No. Is it super fun to do in a gym on a Sunday open mat? Absolutely. And I would highly encourage it. And it just makes you better at defense, right? Because you giving up certain positions and doing things, you're probably going to get caught a lot in the beginning. You're going to have to figure out the timing and make some mistakes. But ultimately, that kind of experimentation, I think, makes your jiu-jitsu better.
Amazing, man. I guess the last question I have for you is, if you're a student listening to this conversation, or alternately, if you're a coach listening to this, how should the paradox of control be applied to your training or even your coaching? Do you have any advice for people if they understand this now and they buy in and they think, yeah, you know what, this makes sense. Sometimes you want to give up a bit of control to create movement. Any kind of closing thoughts or tips you want to give to people about how they could deploy this more effectively in the gym?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't overcomplicate it. I think that if you are finding yourselves in positions like we kind of described, where you're just feeling that you're stuck and they're stuck and everybody's stuck, start opening things up. And this game, as much as it's about anything else, so much of it is about failing, because there's so much learning in the failure. Start making mistakes, start opening things up and like, oops, I shouldn't have done that. Well, next time I'll open it up here instead, and watch how people behave. And the first few times, yes, you might get caught or you might end up on your back. But the more you start to play with this, the more you start to understand there's only so many different ways that the human body can move. And then once you're able to start predicting how that happens in whichever scenario we're talking about, then you can start thinking about how to address that. I talk to my students all the time because so much of jiu-jitsu feels so complicated. But, you know, I tell people it's just like eating an elephant, right? You got to do it one bite at a time. You're not necessarily going to be able to too much control, let it up, and all of a sudden find yourself in this sweet armbar. You know, you may have to do it step by step, and that's okay. We've got plenty of time. Jiu-jitsu takes a long time to get good at, so take the time and play and have fun.
Yeah. You touched on something really important there too, which we didn't mention, which is if you want to learn and get better at jiu-jitsu, you have to give up some control. You have to create openings and movement. I mean, if I am rolling with someone and I take a topside pin on them and I refuse to budge and they can't get out and we sit there for 5 minutes, has anyone really learned anything? Probably not. This is why a lot of coaches, like our friend Rob Bernacki, when they apply gamified approaches to training, a big part of that is creating openings and creating opportunities so that both people get a chance to play. If my strategy for rolling in the gym is I'm going to crush your jaw for 5 minutes and not let you move, I mean, cool, I guess, but neither of us have benefited from this experience. Neither of us have gotten better. One of us is going to go home with a sore jaw, probably, right? So,
or both, right?
Yeah. So what are you really getting? I mean, if you want to learn, you have to create openings. You have to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to play. I think that's so important to the culture of a good gym, and that's probably a good transition. Let's talk about your gym, Rough Hands in Kentucky. I mean, you've been a member of our premium community for a long time, and so a lot of the people who are involved in this probably know the gym by name. But I mean, you were just kind of connected to a seminar tour we just did recently, and we've been talking about going down there at some point. Tell us about the culture and what you do at Rough Hands and how it's different.
Yeah, so it's hard to pinpoint. I mean, I think so much of it is just mindset stuff. We are very fortunate in that we have a few things going on. I would attribute some of it to the fact that we also have a female co-owner. My spouse runs the gym with me. We brag very often that just about every one of our classes is 50-50 gender split. So We have a huge female representation at the school, which we love. And I think it changes so much about the school for the better. And we also have an older population. We've got a lot of grapplers over 35, over 40, and we take play very seriously. I think part of that, the paradox of control, we spend so much time early on being so afraid to fail and make mistakes that we get in this kind of binary mindset of winning and losing. And while I think that is perfectly great in competition when there's a referee on the mat, when you're at the school, when you're at the academy, when you're at the gym, like ultimately, hopefully, your job should be learning. That's where you should be in there experimenting and screwing up and honing and discovering. And so we really try to take that to heart. We're a very playful bunch. We tend, I think like most schools, we tend towards hobbyists, but we do have some very successful competitors. And we love it. We built this gym as an alternative to some of the other places around. We saw a need, and we try to stay true to the imaginary kind of brochure of jiu-jitsu. We spend so much time talking about, jiu-jitsu's for everybody. Jiu-jitsu's for everybody. And there's a lot of academies I've been to over the years where jiu-jitsu is not for everybody. So we tell our kind of tagline we use a lot is like, jiu-jitsu is for anybody, but it's not for everybody. So we do understand that the sport doesn't work. Some people would rather go play pickleball, and that's okay. But the people that are serious about wanting to learn jiu-jitsu, we spend a lot of time making sure that we help them accomplish those goals.
Amazing, man. Well, it sounds like an awesome culture. If people are in the Kentucky area and this has resonated with them, tell us how they can find you if they want to reach out, learn about your gym, contact you, maybe sign up for a free trial or whatever you guys offer. How do they go about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so we're in Louisville, Kentucky, the biggest city in Kentucky. You can find us on all the socials at Rough Hands BJJ and roughhandsbjj.com. We love having visitors, so we're really close to downtown, so we get a lot of work and business travelers. We love having you guys. We're happy to host you all, and anybody else that wants to come by that is nice and friendly and doesn't smell too bad.
It's a big ask sometimes, it feels like, but I agree that's very important. Well, thanks so much, Jesse. I mean, this was an awesome chat, as I always do. I'll put links to all of that stuff in the show notes to make it easy for people to find you. I'll also put a link to our stuff. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. We're getting dangerously close to 300 episodes here. I'm very excited about that milestone. If you want to listen to the whole back catalog, you can just go to our website, bjjmentalmodels.com, to get those episodes for free. Also, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's growing like crazy. I'm really happy with what we put out there. There's a lot of great free content, as well as a lot of freebies that we give out to the people who take the time to subscribe. Again, that's also free, and you can get that from the website. Beyond all of that, if you want to kick it up to the next level with us, BJJ Mental Models Premium is what we offer. It's how we pay the bills. It's how we do some of the cool stuff that we do. It's the reason why we're not ad funded here. Everything we do is supported by our premium community. Join Premium and you're going to get access to a massive library of audio courses on jiu-jitsu strategy, tactics, concept, mindset, philosophy, the kind of stuff that a lot of video instructionals don't really get into much because they're so focused on technique. I've always found that stuff to be useful to a point. But if you listen to this podcast and you benefit from kind of the more high-level conceptual discussion of jiu-jitsu, that's what we offer. We've also got some awesome premium podcasts like The Highest Levels, hosted by multi-time world champ Emily Kwok and Johannan. We've got State of the Meta, which is a great competition analysis podcast by Drew Foster. You get to be part of our community. Jesse's actually been a premium subscriber for a long time, and thank you, Jesse, for your support as well. And of course, if you go up to the next tier with us, you will get direct coaching from quite literally some of the best and coolest black belts in the world. I'm really happy with the service we put together. I'm hoping that we can hit 600 subscribers pretty soon. We're getting close, so please do consider signing up if you haven't already. First week is free. And yeah, I mean, Jesse, thanks for coming by. And of course, thanks for supporting us all these years. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Steve, thanks so much for having me. This was a blast. I hope we get to do it again soon.
Absolutely, man. It was great to chat. And I hope that, we've been talking about going down and doing a tour at some point in Kentucky. And I mean, if we ever go down there, of course, I'd love to crash your gym.
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, thanks, buddy. And thanks to everyone listening. Talk to you next week. See you soon.